Great. So I have the privilege of introducing our very first speaker, who is Gina Sapiro. She is the professor of political science and former dean of the arts and sciences at Boston University. She's an internationally recognized expert on gender politics and political psychology, elections, and political participation, and she's a former director of the American National Election Studies. And so we'd love to hear more from you. Please come up here.
Thank you. Thank you to Cynthia and Amy for organizing this. And I also want to give a shout out to another person here, my brilliant and gorgeous and very feminist son over there. I'm proud to have raised a son. And I'm proud to have raised a son who's a public servant. And given that he works at the CBO, is going to have to get his hands very dirty over the next 4 years. So wish him Godspeed. Good afternoon to all of you and welcome here. Being the opening speaker in this amazing group is really not too intimidating. As a political scientist, I don't stray very far from well-collected data and rigorously constructed analysis. That said, since I started voting, my preferred candidates lost more often than they won. But no winner has ever made me fear so much for the democratic aspirations of my country. I don't need to list the reasons for you. You know them. The other speakers, I think, will talk mostly about particular areas of action for us moving forward. I will use my time to clear away some underbrush and clarify what we know about our political situation and how we got to this point in hopes of providing some helpful background for our task of figuring out what specific paths each one of us is going to choose to make a real difference after this. So how did we end up with this president and this presidency? Let's work backwards from the gap between the popular and electoral college vote. We all know that President Trump did not win the popular vote. The popular vote does tell us something about the aggregate preferences of the 2016 American voter, but it does not necessarily give us the winner, as we now know. And it didn't this time, because the winner is decided by the Electoral College, first designed in the Constitution and revised by the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1804. The Electoral College designers rejected the idea of a presidential election by majority vote or by a system of one individual voter, one vote. The Electoral College weighs the individual votes cast by voters in the inland, more rural, less populous areas of the country more heavily than the individual votes cast in the more populous, more urban areas. That's just what it does. The Electoral College designers chose this approach and wanted it that way for 3 reasons. First, they chose an Electoral College rather than direct election by the people because they didn't fully trust the people's judgment. But that doesn't explain why this counting method was used. Second, if the presidency were decided by popular vote, one voter, one vote, the more populous urban states would win more often than not, and the other states' interests would lose more often than not. So the representatives of the big, more rural places fought hard for and won a system that gives benefit to the less populous states to balance their interests in more, or they'd always lose. But even that was not the clinching reason why we have the particular design we have. The Electoral College is based on representation in the House of Representatives plus the Senate. The Electoral College therefore embeds the 3/5 compromise of the Constitutional Convention, which gave Southern slave states a big bonus of representation based on the presence of men as well as women who, of course, were not allowed to vote back then. The system calculated an additional 3/5 of a vote to their total weight for every African American in their population, that is, given their laws, for every enslaved person they owned. So this Electoral College system is not, and never was, based on the principle of one voter, one vote. Why have we kept this unique system that contravenes the one person, one vote principle? Because it's the American system. Now, If you prefer the principle of one voter, one vote in principle equally when a Republican or Democrat benefits, you might choose this periodic battle to eliminate the Electoral College as yours. But you will be opposed by the weight of people in all those big, vast geographic areas that look very red, as opposed to those little tiny islands all over the country that look blue. So let's leave the Electoral College now and focus on the general election. In the end, what does the best analysis tell us about why the election came out as it did? And how does that tell us something about moving forward? Clinton, as we know, won the popular vote, but that vote was systematically maldistributed for winning the Electoral College. Why did that happen? And what might it have to do with our task? Now, before you start thinking about whether she should have spent more time in Michigan or Wisconsin, I want to set a scene that is absolutely crucial for understanding how electoral politics is working in order to avoid some serious errors in our strategies going forward. The early public opinion polls led some people to believe that the Democrats would win in a landslide. But the polls don't predict. They give a current snapshot. It was never going to be that easy because, as the political science mantra goes, party identification is a powerful drug. And partisanship is especially powerful in a strong time of polarization. Now, here's a truth most people find counterintuitive. Almost all research shows that electoral campaigns don't make nearly as much difference ever in presidential elections as most people think. Campaigns have far less power in determining outcomes than the electorate's standing partisan inclinations. I know this seems weird, given how much money we spend on them, but it's true. Remember this phrase and take it home with you. Partisanship is a strong drug. Public opinion and vote intentions were always going to start sliding back toward the distribution of party identification in this country. As we approached the election, events and tactics gave one candidate or the other a boost, but then candidate support would slide back toward that partisan norm, which throughout 2016 was closely divided. Nationally, about 48% Democrats, 44% Republicans, only 8% true independents. But that norm has been moving, and in a way that has been making a difference for years now. White people, especially those without the highest level of education, have been becoming more Republican and did so again in a significant way, especially bigly, in a small handful of swing states. Further, to understand the forces at work this time, we can't just look at this time. To understand presidential election politics, we can't just pay attention to the presidential elections. Certainly, to have an impact on American politics and policy, we must become more attentive to congressional, state, and local politics. Let's look at some history from the Clinton era forward. The House of Representatives. Democrats lost the House in 1994, the first Clinton midterm, regained it in 2006, the second Bush midterm, surged in 2008, the Obama election, then lost it in 2010, the first Obama midterm. See a pattern? That year, the second Obama midterm, the House Democrats sunk to their lowest level since 1946. And before that, to go lower, you'd have to go to 1928. Democrats gained 6 House seats this year, but given that there was a majority vote for the Democratic candidate for president, that's not really very impressive. The Senate. Democrats lost the Senate in 1994, first Clinton midterm, regained it in 2008, Obama election, although twice in between it was 50-50 divided. The Democrats lost the Senate in 2014, the second Obama midterm. Let's look at state level. Governorships. From 2007 to 2009, Republicans held 22 of the nation's governorships, 22 in that period. But after that, they've dramatically increased their control, hitting a historic high through the 2016 election of 33, from 22 to 33. In that period of time, that is big. State legislatures. In 2010, Republicans controlled both houses of state legislatures in 9 states. The Democrats then lost a massive number of state legislative seats and ceded control of many of them to Republicans. Whether Hillary Clinton traveled to Michigan or Wisconsin in October or November or was a flawed candidate may well have made a difference, but it didn't make that difference. The Republicans have experienced a strong tailwind in recent years, not just in electoral outcomes, but underneath it all, in the basic partisanship of white people, especially the less educated, and especially but not only men, especially in small town and rural communities in the vast center of the country. The underlying causes of this shift do relate to race, ethnicity, and gender, as I'll discuss in a second. But there are other important causes of this shift, causes in which most people in this room are likely implicated and ignore at our peril if we want to strengthen policies of justice and equality and forge the coalitions that will be necessary to accomplish that. I live in the Northeast now, but I spent over 30 years living in the Midwest, partly in small town and agricultural areas. Understand well that people in those communities are fully aware that big city and coastal types think they're stupid, uneducated, uncultured, don't eat the right foods, or listen to the right music. They know they are the butt of coastal and big city jokes. In the Midwest, we in fact used to call them coasties. They hear themselves attacked as racist and sexist by people who don't know them personally. And while we know that racism, sexism, and even xenophobia are more visible than in a long time, that doesn't sum up everything that's happening. And anyway, calling people names doesn't make them think differently and join you. They are aware that big city and coastal people have experienced significant economic recovery since the 2008 crash, and they are painfully aware that big city and coastal people don't know and don't care that the economic recovery hasn't really reached them. Read recent books like Arlie Russell Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land or Kathy Walsh's Resentment on the Rise of Scott Walker, and you'll read more from the mouths of people who will talk to you about this. Partisanship is a strong drug. Whatever horrific things Donald Trump said or did, even those who disapproved of him voted for him if they were inclined toward the Republican Party. And note this, people voted for the presidential candidate they trusted more. Hillary got a majority of the votes, but people who really didn't trust either Clinton or Trump, and there were lots of those, broke very strongly for Trump because they said they don't trust either of them, they don't trust politicians, but at least he may try something different and maybe listen to us. So finally, let's look at gender and race. Yes, gender and race played huge roles in this election. Race talk and gender talk played into and exacerbated partisan differences. The different racial ethnic groups have very different partisan bases, as you know, and in virtually every social group, there was some degree of gender difference in partisanship and candidate support, although different amounts of gender difference. Yes, women are somewhat more Democratic than the men, and men are somewhat more Republican than the women. Gender differences have been most notable and weighty among white people. That gender difference sometimes means the majority of men and women vote for different people. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the majority of women and men both vote for the same candidate, but by very different margins. That is what happened this past year. White men voted heavily for Trump. White women went marginally for Trump. African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, urban people, highly educated people supported Clinton. The gender gap existed, as always. Partisanship tipped the election and made the crucial difference for women also in the marginal states that have been moving more Republican. In 2016, white men leaned decidedly Republican in their partisanship, 61%. White women split almost evenly. There was even a gender gap in the Democratic Party, which you may not be aware of. In every Democratic Party, every Democratic primary in which there were exit polls, every single one, men were more likely to support Bernie Sanders than women were, and women were more likely to support Hillary Clinton. If only men voted in the Democratic primaries, Sanders would have won 8 additional states. If only women voted, Clinton would have won 2 additional states. We can't explain that away by gender differences in partisanship or even ideology. So gender and race, sexism and racism all had impacts in the 2016 election. A very recent good study shows systematically controlling for everything else, even economic dislocation, hostile sexism and racism had an effect on Trump voting, and interestingly, doing the same analysis shows that those things did not have an impact on Obama versus Romney voting. So we have a Trump problem, a Trump associates problem, and a problem with the encouragement of anti-democratic forces. That's small d democratic. So where do I see the implications of this Politics 101 thing for what we should do? 2 things. 1, a huge portion of the policies most of us care about are decided in critical ways at the state and local level, not the federal level. At the levels where progressive politics has been losing most rapidly, and where relatively few people pay attention. Young people rarely vote or pay attention to local politics. We need a national movement to pay attention to local and state politics. That's what the Koch brothers have been doing. And finally, we have to think about our coalitions among women differently. Clearly, without strong multiracial, racial, ethnic, and cultural coalitions, we are lost. But we must also identify particular needs and interests where we can work together despite partisan differences. The women of the more rural, small towns, communities, women who are less educated, must be part of the coalition, and that means for us listening and not just telling. It means figuring out how they see things, not just how they would see things if they understood what we want them to understand. Real coalitions are difficult to achieve because everyone must be willing to learn and to compromise. We must think carefully about how to do that. Unfortunately, that's not the dominant flavor of this highly partisan, often toxic political environment we now live in. Wow. Why is it that the only phrase that comes to mind to wrap that thought up is, yes, we can. Yes, we can, but it will take hard work, serious strategy, and a good dose of humility. Thank you.